Russia rolled into Ukraine in 2022 with one of the biggest, strongest tank fleets ever assembled. It was expected that that fleet, made up of a mixture of modern marvels like the T-90M and steadfast Soviet-era workhorses like the T-72, would play a critical role in securing a crushing, comprehensive victory for Vladimir Putin's forces. But that hasn't happened. Through a mixture of Russia's incompetent tactics and embarrassing intelligence failures, combined with Ukraine's valiant defensive efforts, the Russian army has suffered truly historic, unprecedented tank losses and remains unable to make the most of its armor advantage. It wasn't supposed to work out this way. Russia has long been famous for its tanks, dating back to the days of the Soviet Union. During World War II, for example, Soviet forces produced and deployed some of the mightiest military machines of the era, like the iconic T-34, renowned for its ability to adapt to challenging conditions with ease, but plagued by its own faults. Or the destructive Su-152, boasting enough firepower to destroy almost any enemy tank or armored vehicle in its way with a single well-placed shot. Moving on into the Cold War era, the Soviet Union continued to demonstrate an almost uncanny ability to design and develop world-leading tanks, introducing models like the T-55, which went on to be one of the most widely produced tanks in history, the T-62, which featured the world's first smoothbore tank gun, and the T-72, which became the backbone of Soviet forces until the Union eventually dissolved and has continued to play a major role in Russian military operations to this day. While Russia's latest tanks are still yet to be truly put to the test, there's no doubt that the country has a rich reputation of producing tanks that are incredibly strong, versatile, and difficult to defeat. And when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began at the beginning of 2022, many military analysts pointed to Russia's enormous stockpiles of both modern and Soviet-era tanks as one of the Kremlin's biggest advantages. Ukraine, too, had some older Soviet tanks stored away for a rainy day, but it couldn't contend with the sheer quantity of tanks at its opponent's disposal. While exact numbers are difficult to ascertain, numerous organizations reported that Russia had close to 3,000 operational main battle tanks, MBTs, at the beginning of the war, with thousands more stored away in military warehouses and other facilities across the country, ready to roll out onto the battlefield should they be needed. The near 3,000 active MBTs included some very strong variants, like the aforementioned T-72 and the more modern T-80 and T-90 models, which were all regarded as highly capable and effective war machines, with enough armor to withstand enemy attacks and enough firepower to obliterate any forces standing in their way. Analysts expected these tanks to crush whatever defenses Ukraine might be able to muster, leading the Russian charge to victory and spearheading the country's assaults on not only the contested territories of the Donbass region, but onward into Ukraine's major cities like Kharkiv and Kyiv. Indeed, the sheer weight of Russia's tank strength is, without a doubt, one of the reasons why Putin and his commanders were so confident of a quick victory when the war first began. They foresaw no possible way in which Ukraine could stop these mighty machines from rolling down their roads, blowing up their buildings, and laying waste to their fortifications. And for a brief time, it looked like that's exactly what would happen. The early days of the war involved Russian forces assaulting Ukraine along 5 major axes, striking at some of the biggest city centers, including Kyiv. They captured large swathes of territory with speed and efficiency, while Ukraine struggled to respond, having to divide its focus between evacuating as many of its people as possible to safer locations, mounting defenses in the towns and cities that had the most strategic value, and allocating its limited resources as and where they were needed. It looked as though Russia was on course to achieve exactly what it set out to do, with its enormous tank fleet proving its worth as the country's forces captured 1 square mile of land after another. Yet, by the end of spring 2022, everything had changed. Russia's progress hadn't just slowed, it had stalled, and in many areas the country's forces were being pushed back. Captured land was reclaimed by Ukrainians, and the Kremlin's army suddenly found itself on the back foot, forced to transition from large-scale combat operations to much smaller assault forces. It withdrew from its northern axis around the Kyiv and the Sumy Oblast, focusing more of its efforts instead on the eastern regions, and its losses began to spiral, with supposedly unbeatable, indestructible tanks blown to bits by Ukraine's brave defenders. Years have passed since those early stages, but Russia has still not been able to find a way to return to those early tactics that proved so effective. It continues to rely on small-scale infantry forces, largely without much or any armor backing them up, in a bid to take ground and achieve objectives, rather than rushing in and overwhelming its opponents with vast armored divisions and destructive dominant tank formations. A detailed analysis of this strategic shift was written by US Army veteran and author Brian Powers and published on the official US Army website. In his analysis, Powers cites many factors leading to Russia's transition to smaller, predominantly dismounted infantry offensive actions, including the rapid rise of unmanned aerial systems across the battlefields of Ukraine, which changed the state of play completely and caused both sides to rethink their tactics. He also, however, notes that one of the big reasons why Russia has been unable to mass forces and orchestrate large-scale assaults along key frontline locations is quite simply because it suffered such dramatic and devastating MBT and armoured vehicle losses over the course of the conflict so far. We don't know exactly how many tanks have been damaged or destroyed, but the figure is clearly in the thousands. Open source intelligence analysis group, Oryx, for example, has reported more than 4,300 visually verified Russian tank losses in Ukraine since the invasion began, along with over 8,700 armoured and infantry fighting vehicles. If we consider that, according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies 2021 military balance, Russia had anywhere between 2,800 and 3,330 operational tanks at the start of the war. That means it's lost up to 143% of its entire operational task force. As Powers notes, these losses account for the largest armoured vehicle losses that Russia has suffered since World War II, and a higher total number of losses than compared to all armoured vehicle losses incurred in conflicts from 1946 to 2022, in which Russia, or its predecessor, the Soviet Union, participated. That is a remarkably damning statistic, and it's backed up by hard data. In the Soviet-Afghanistan War, for example, which began in 1979 and extended throughout the 1980s, the Soviet Union lost an estimated 147 MBTs. It lost a mere 6 in the Russia-Moldova War of 1992, 192 more in the First Chechen War, 23 in the Second Chechen War, 4 in the Russo-Georgia War, and an estimated 100 more in the Donbass War, giving a combined tally of around 665 total tanks lost between the end of World War II and the start of the Ukraine invasion. That's a mere fraction of the losses seen since 2022, and some sources suggest that Russia has lost even more tanks. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, for example, claims that Ukraine has, in fact, destroyed or captured close to 10,000 tanks and over 20,000 armoured fighting vehicles. These figures may be exaggerated to a certain extent, but numerous independent open-source intelligence groups, organizations, and analysts all agree that Russia has seen thousands of its tanks taken out of action by Ukraine's drones, mines, missiles, and other anti-tank weapons. And with the war still raging on and no clear end in sight, we're beginning to reach the point where Russia is almost running on empty as far as tanks are concerned. Recent open-source intelligence reports have found that the country has less than 3,000 tanks in storage at this time, and over half of them are believed to be in poor condition. Less than a quarter can be classed as usable in modern battlefield conditions, and the vast majority are antiquated, outdated models with less than 100 of the relatively modern T-80 MBTs. This shows just how heavily Russia has been forced to rely on its stored Soviet-era tanks. Its forces have been seen on numerous occasions dragging rusty old relics out of dusty storage facilities to replace those that have been destroyed, sometimes deploying tanks that are 50, 60, or even 70 plus years old, like T-54s and T-55s, which originally entered service way back in the late 1940s. Experts have long debated how and why this has happened, and the fact of the matter is that there's not one single reason behind Russia's dramatic tank losses. Instead, it's a whole multitude of factors that have all come together in a chaotic cocktail, decimating the Kremlin's armored fleet and leaving Russian troops running into battle with minimal armor to back them up. Russia's overconfidence and arrogant tactics at the start of the war, for example, are partly to blame for the country's subsequent losses. Back when the war began, many in Moscow believed that Ukraine would simply roll over, that there would be minimal resistance to overcome, that many Ukrainian people would wave, cheer and welcome Russia's liberators into their lands with open arms. Fed false intelligence by its Federal Security Service, FSB, Russia's leadership went into the war feeling absolutely sure that it would be all over in a matter of days. As a result, they didn't take the necessary time to plan out their invasion with the level of precision and strategic intelligence it deserved. They thought that their larger, stronger force would simply be enough to break down any opposition and that the flag of Russia would rise above the streets of Kyiv in a matter of weeks, if not days. This in part led to a lot of tanks being taken out in the early stages. Because rather than entering dangerous areas in strict, structured formations, with plenty of infantry troops to escort them and fend off possible flanking attempts or surprise strikes, Russia's tanks were often dispatched in random, illogical ways with minimal tactical oversight. This resulted in many being cornered and taken out by Ukrainian soldiers, and there were even reports in the early weeks of civilians managing to capture Russian tanks or attacking them with Molotov cocktails and other makeshift weapons. Russia also didn't expect Ukraine to receive so much aid from its allies around the world so soon into the conflict. It didn't take long at all for countries like the United Kingdom and United States to dispatch anti-tank weaponry to Kyiv's defenders, with the US sending around 5,000 Javelin anti-tank missiles in April of 2022, and the UK providing more than 4,000 next-generation light anti-tank weapons, or NLAWs, by late March of the same year. Designed to attack tanks from above and target their weaker, thinner sections of armor, these powerful rockets made it remarkably easy for Ukrainian troops to wipe Russian tanks off the map. In addition to receiving weapons from the West, Ukrainian forces also utilized their own anti-tank systems, including mines, missiles, and artillery, making the most of their home field advantage to catch Russian tank columns off guard and exploit the enemy's tactical lapses at every available opportunity. There are also notable flaws in almost every single tank that Russia deployed in Ukraine. The T-72, for example, which has been the backbone of the country's ground forces for decades now, may have a lot of positives. It's extremely lightweight, for example, and relatively cheap to make, but it also has a gigantic design flaw that's seen some experts label it as the death sentence tank. It infamously features an automated loading system, which requires easy access to the tank's ammunition storage in order to operate effectively. Because of this, the T-72's ammunition is often stored in the turret, and all it takes is one well-aimed missile, rocket or drone strike to that turret to send the entire machine up in flames. Since Ukraine is a former Soviet republic, its soldiers are fully familiar with the T-72, so they knew all about this weakness and worked hard to find ways to exploit it. As a result, a large percentage of Russia's tank losses have been T-72 variants, like the T-72A and T-72B. As stated earlier, Russia has also been compelled to use much older tanks in its frontline assaults on Ukrainian towns, cities, and defensive positions, some of which date back to the early days of the Cold War. The world was a very different place when those tanks were made, and they simply weren't designed with the rigors of 21st century battlefields in mind. Consequently, many of those older tanks have basically been little more than death traps for the poor, unfortunate soldiers tasked with taking them into battle. The T-62, for example, which was a fine tank for its day when it entered service in the 1960s, is just not cut out for combat in the 2020s. Ukraine's forces have shared videos and images online of their brigades taking these tanks out with mines, drones, artillery, and missiles. But with so many of its more modern tanks already out of action, Russia has few other options but to keep on using these near-useless relics of a bygone age. At the other end of the spectrum, even Russia's latest and greatest tanks have also proven unsuitable for use in Ukraine, albeit for very different reasons. The T-14 Armata, for example, has been heralded by Russian officials as one of, if not the greatest tank ever made. It's supposed to be an unstoppable, irrepressible force, boasting next-level firepower and advanced technologies. Yet, it hasn't been seen in Ukraine. Why? Well, according to Russia's own officials, it's because this tank is simply too expensive to make, and the country doesn't want to risk losing large numbers of T-14s to cheap drones and Western weapons when it's already having such a difficult time with its economy and spiraling defense budget. Another of Russia's so-called state-of-the-art modern battle tanks is the T-90M. The country has recently announced ramped-up production rates for this particular tank, with factories said to be churning out record levels of new units. Despite that, Ukrainian soldiers report only rare sightings of T-90Ms along the front lines and in occupied territories. Once again, this is believed to be linked to concerns around the cost of these tanks. Each one can cost in excess of $4 million to make, as well as the fact that Russia is worried about its military reputation taking a serious hit if it starts deploying these advanced tanks only for Ukraine to take them out one after another. Ultimately, it doesn't matter whether Russia uses old tanks or new ones, as none of them have proven capable of allowing the country to achieve its military objectives and crush Ukrainian defenses. Instead, Ukraine has consistently shown that no matter what Russia throws its way, it will find a way to eliminate it, most often with the aid of drones. Because this war, more than any other conflict, has come to be dominated by drones. Russia regularly relies on them to bombard Ukrainian towns and cities, killing and injuring civilians while dealing as much damage as possible to the likes of residential buildings and other infrastructure. Ukraine, meanwhile, often deploys its increasingly diverse and deadly drone army to take out Russia's most important military assets, including tanks and armored vehicles, rendering the Kremlin's enormous armor advantage almost worthless. Now, the war has reached a stage where Russia not only has fewer and fewer tanks to call on, but is more frightened than ever about actually using them, because it's facing an enemy that has mastered the art of blowing even the biggest and toughest tanks to pieces. And the Kremlin's commanders have no idea how to handle that. As Powers notes, Russia has largely been reduced to deploying its armor in what he calls near-suicidal front assaults, sometimes involving as few as 2 lone vehicles and age-old tanks equipped with coke cages, ad hoc armor, and metal slapped onto the sides or top of the vehicle to protect against first-person view, FPV drone attacks, and drone-dropped munitions. The US Army veteran goes on to explain how coordinated movements of trained vehicle crews and tactical unit formations are now noticeably absent from Russia's tactics. Instead, the Kremlin's officers ordered troops to advance as quickly as possible on Ukrainian positions, a tactic that often leads to near-instant chaos. While Powers describes Russia's strategy as failed and futile, CSIS noted in November 2025 that Russia continues to adapt its tactics, testing new ways to penetrate Ukrainian defenses. Despite these adjustments, Powers argues that the Kremlin remains stubbornly committed to ineffective systems, persisting with approaches that have repeatedly failed. The Russian army is quite literally being decimated because it's simply not possible to win or even efficiently fight a war like this one without sufficient armor. Objectives aren't being achieved, progress remains slow, and gains are minimal because troops are always going to struggle to get things done when they don't have tanks or even armored vehicles to back them up. But Russia doesn't seem to care. Putin and his commanders continue to burn through resources and throw men into the meat grinder, failing to capitalize on the enormous advantages they had at the start of the war and now wasting time and lives on futile assaults and meaningless missions. The longer this goes on, the more unsustainable it becomes. And with Russia continuing to struggle in so many other areas, Putin must be looking back and wishing he'd used his tank advantage much more effectively back when this war began. Now, you can learn more about Russia's ongoing woes in this video, which looks at how the Kremlin's once solid front line is starting to crumble and collapse. Or check out this deep dive into how the endgame for Putin has already begun, with the Russian president stuck between a rock and a hard place with nowhere to go and nothing but misery lying ahead. And finally, to make sure you don't miss out on the latest breaking news from the front lines of Ukraine, make sure to subscribe to our channel today and turn on notifications to be among the first in the world to see our latest reports.